She stood on the courthouse steps, calm while her daughter-in-law screamed, "You lied about my mind to steal what I built. Now the world knows." Cameras rolled. Reporters closed in. Celia lunged. Security stepped between them. Margaret didn't flinch. "Let's raise awareness. Together." "You think a mother can't fight back? You haven't heard the rest." "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." The tea was sweet. Just a little too sweet. Margaret sipped carefully, the ceramic cup warm between her hands, but something about the honey tasted off. Not poisoned, no, nothing dramatic like that. But it was the kind of sweet meant to distract, like a glaze on something gone sour underneath. Across the table, Celia smiled that polished, performative smile, the one Margaret had come to recognize as camouflage. They were seated on the patio, late morning sunlight dancing across the white linen tablecloth. A vase of fresh tulips sat in the center, and the clinking of cutlery mingled with small talk from the two couples Celia had invited from her yoga class. "Oh, Margie," Celia said with a titter, slicing a scone with a butter knife as if it required delicate surgery. "Did you forget where we were again this week? You wandered into the neighbor's driveway on Tuesday." Margaret blinked slowly. The other guests gave polite, uncomfortable laughs, eyes flicking toward her with quiet judgment. "That wasn't the neighbor's driveway," Margaret said calmly. "That was the mailbox." "Oh, right," Celia said, not missing a beat. "It's just, you've been a little more distracted lately. It's totally normal at your age. My mother was the same before. Well, you know." She didn't say before the facility. She didn't have to. Margaret set her tea down and folded her napkin in her lap with precise care. She could feel it in the air. Thick, syrupy condescension masked as concern. Celia was laying bricks for something, one quiet implication at a time. Aaron sat beside Celia, oddly quiet. He kept his gaze on his plate, using the back of his fork to crush a blueberry that had rolled out of the fruit bowl. He hadn't defended Margaret once, not today, not yesterday, not since he moved her into the guest suite temporarily 3 months ago. Margaret leaned back slightly, her hands folded. The guests changed the subject to real estate. Celia laughed too hard at something one of them said. Margaret's hearing wasn't what it used to be, but she didn't need to hear every word. Tone was enough, and today's tone was clear. This woman is fading. Poor thing. After the brunch ended and the guests had left with half-eaten pastries wrapped in napkins, Margaret excused herself and went upstairs. Her steps were measured, slow, intentional. In the guest suite, formerly Aaron's office, she sat on the bed and opened the pill organizer on her nightstand. The Monday slot was empty. She hadn't taken Monday's pill. She knew she hadn't, but it was gone. She reached behind the drawer lining into the corner where she'd taped a backup key. Unlocking the small safe beneath her bed, she pulled out a different pill organizer, the one she actually used. Inside were Monday through Sunday, all doses accounted for, which meant the decoy, the one Celia had access to, was missing a pill Margaret hadn't touched. She returned everything just as it was and sat down, her mind suddenly sharper than it had felt in months. Someone was setting the stage, quietly, patiently, sweetly. Downstairs, she heard Aaron's voice through the vent. "I just don't know how much longer we can keep an eye on her like this." "She won't even notice," Celia replied. "It's already slipping." She didn't remember what day it was. Margaret smiled slightly. That had been on purpose. That night, while the house went dark and Celia took her glass of wine to bed, Margaret crept downstairs barefoot. She checked the door locks, tested them, then gently turned the knob to her guest suite, stepped inside, and locked it behind her. With the bolt slid into place, she leaned close to the mirror, eyes sharp, voice barely above a whisper. "Let's see how long they think I don't know." Margaret locks her room and whispers, "Let's see how long they think I don't know." "They said I misplaced the silverware, but I watched her pocket the spoon." It wasn't even subtle this time. The missing spoon was a prop, and Margaret knew it the moment Celia's voice rang out from the kitchen, high-pitched and breathless like a sitcom actress overplaying shock. "Has anyone seen the sterling soup spoon?" Celia called out. "The one from Aaron's grandmother's set? Margaret used it this morning." Margaret, seated quietly on the sunroom loveseat, looked up from her book. The air smelled faintly of orange blossoms and deception. "I rinsed it and left it by the sink," she said evenly. Celia leaned around the doorway, a smile too wide on her face. "Well, it's not there now. Maybe you put it down, but you didn't? Or maybe it ended up in the trash. Accidents happen." Her tone was syrupy sweet, meant for an audience, and sure enough, Aaron appeared behind her, brow furrowed in concern. "It's fine," he said, trying to keep things neutral. "We'll find it. No big deal." Margaret nodded slowly, eyes narrowing just enough to see the edges of the performance. No one asked if Celia had checked her apron. The footage told a different story. That evening, after dinner, dishes clinked and Aaron settled in with the news, Margaret retreated to her room and locked the door. She pulled her laptop from its hiding spot inside a hollowed-out dictionary, an old spy trick she never thought she'd actually use. The small camera above the pantry door had been running since last week. Disguised as an air freshener, it recorded on motion detection and uploaded footage to her private cloud. She queued up the file from that morning. There it was, Margaret rinsing the spoon and placing it on the drying rack. 15 minutes later, Celia entering the kitchen alone. She glanced around, then casually slipped the spoon into the pocket of her cardigan. She checked her reflection in the oven door, fluffed her hair and stepped into the hallway, calling for Aaron as she went. Margaret sat back in her chair. No rage, no tears, just clarity. Later that night, Aaron knocked on her door. "Mom, you got a minute?" She opened it, expression carefully blank. He stepped inside, running a hand through his hair. "Celia's just concerned. She says you've been misplacing things a lot lately. And the spoon this morning." "I told her where I left it," Margaret said softly. I know," Aaron said, eyes darting. "But this isn't the first thing. Last week you said you couldn't find your glasses and they were in your purse." "I must have forgotten," she said, with just enough hesitation to make it believable. Aaron let out a breath. "Maybe we should get you checked out, just to rule things out." Margaret nodded, expression gentle. "If it would make you feel better, dear." He looked relieved, grateful, almost proud of himself for managing the situation. After he left, Margaret turned back to her laptop. She inserted a small red flash drive into the side and dragged the video file into the folder labeled Plan A, Initiated. She didn't trust the cloud entirely. Some things had to be kept close, offline, tangible. The spoon was just a test, a dress rehearsal, and they had failed. Outside her window, the garden lights flickered on. Celia passed by the hydrangeas, her shadow moving like a silhouette against the blinds. She paused, glanced up at Margaret's window, then moved along. Margaret watched her go, one spoon down, one lie exposed, dozens to go. She backs up footage to a flash drive labeled Plan A. "She thought my memory slipped. I remembered every clause I wrote into the trust. The office smelled like paper, leather, and quiet revenge." Margaret pressed the elevator button with her gloved finger, the brass plaque reading Crawford, Levin, and Bloom, Estate Law. She hadn't been here in nearly 9 years, yet her feet still knew the path from the lobby to Suite 402 like muscle memory. She stepped through the frosted glass doors into a familiar waiting area. The receptionist, new, early 20s, clearly not expecting someone like Margaret to move with such precision, looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" "I have a legacy," Margaret said calmly. "Tell Marla Rothman that Margaret Ellis is here." Moments later, Marla appeared from behind a glass door, still sharp in her late 60s, with salt and ink black curls and a mind like a steel trap. She blinked in stunned delight. "Well, I'll be damned," Marla said, stepping forward and embracing her old client. "I was just thinking of you last week when I read a story about a woman whose family tried to have her committed for control of her estate." Margaret chuckled softly. "Timely. Let's go inside." They sat across from each other at a polished walnut table, sunlight filtering in through half-open blinds. Marla poured 2 glasses of water with lemon slices floating on top and pulled out Margaret's file, still intact, still thick. "Everything's held in your maiden name, just like you requested," Marla said, flipping through the documents. "And your living trust already protects a lot. but something tells me this isn't just a social call. Margaret nodded. Celia's been setting the stage. Passive-aggressive digs at brunch. A spoon that vanished. She's positioning me as forgetful, confused. Building a case, quietly but deliberately. Marla's eyes narrowed. They're not just angling for power, they're testing boundaries. Margaret leaned forward. I want to review every clause, every word. If there's a window of vulnerability in what we wrote a decade ago, we seal it. Marla opened the folder and turned it to her. You remember the structure? I remember every clause I wrote into the trust, Margaret replied, steady as stone. Even the line about conditional distribution based on the care provided. That was always there for them, not me. Marla gave a low whistle. You always were 10 steps ahead. Margaret smiled faintly. But now, I want to add something more specific. Marla tilted her head. Such as? A stipulation that if evidence of attempted guardianship without medical basis is presented, falsified claims, emotional coercion, financial manipulation, the trustee may dissolve all inheritance claims immediately. Marla raised both eyebrows. You want to bury the sword before they swing it. No, Margaret said, eyes locked on hers. I want to make sure they stab themselves with it. Marla sat back, a grin forming. That's poetic. Also legally sound. She began typing. Margaret watched her fingers move across the keyboard, the rapid click of keys a kind of music, one she hadn't heard since her late husband's estate planning days. Back then, she and Marla had spent hours together, organizing and protecting what little they had. But it was enough, because it had been honest. Marla paused. Do you want to update the executorship? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Name Janet Cole as secondary executor. She's seen Celia firsthand. She's trustworthy. Marla typed it in. And, Margaret added, voice low, let's prepare a second version. Slightly different. Slightly less threatening, in case they ever force my hand. Marla stopped typing. Looked up. A decoy? Margaret's expression was calm but unshakable. Just in case. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows between downtown buildings. Margaret stepped into the late afternoon air, crisp wind brushing against her cheek like a whisper from her younger self. She walked with a new rhythm now, one that carried history in its stride. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Margaret tells Marla, let's prepare a different version, just in case. They thought they were clever, but I taught chess, not checkers. The calendar appeared overnight, like a planted seed. It hung just outside Margaret's bedroom door, neat, color-coded, with glittery gold lettering at the top, Mom's memory tracker. Each day had a blank space for notes, some already had small check marks beside them. Margaret stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at it as if it were ticking. Just something to help us all stay organized, Celia said the next morning, waving a hand as she buttered toast. You know, appointments, pills, meals, little moments you might forget. She didn't say you've been forgetting. She didn't have to. Margaret smiled. Very thoughtful. That week she began playing their game. Each morning she crossed off the wrong date on purpose, wrote, took meds at 9 a.m. when she hadn't, scribbled random notes like, talked to doctor, or did I, in shaky cursive. She let her voice trail off during dinner, let her eyes wander mid-conversation. When Aaron asked if she remembered where she'd put the keys, she looked confused, then brightened. In the freezer, right next to my patients. They all laughed nervously. But inside, Margaret was watching, memorizing, moving pieces. 2 Thursdays later, she sat in a private office at the Elmhurst Neurological Center. The room was soft-lit and quiet, with faint sounds of typing and paper shuffling in the hallway. Her neurologist, Dr. Rashida Lang, reviewed the results of her cognitive scan with clinical precision. You're in the 95th percentile for your age bracket, Dr. Lang said. No signs of degenerative memory loss, no red flags, not even mild cognitive impairment. Margaret exhaled through her nose. Can I get that in writing? Dr. Lang smiled. I had a feeling you'd ask. They walked to the front desk together. Margaret paid in cash. No insurance trail, no family notifications. The sealed envelope was handed to her in a manila folder. Would you like us to mail a copy to your primary? No, Margaret said quickly, but I do have a mailing address I'd like it sent to. She handed over a small handwritten note. A secure P.O. box 2 towns over, one Celia and Aaron knew nothing about. That evening, Celia stood at the foot of the calendar with a pen in hand, pretending to be thoughtful while reviewing Margaret's latest entry. Mom wrote that she had a phone call with Dr. Pineapple, she said with a laugh. She's really slipping. Aaron offered a sheepish shrug. It's not that weird. She's just playful. Celia rolled her eyes. She's drawing elephants on Thursdays. Margaret, seated nearby with her knitting, looked up with mock innocence. Oh, I thought the elephant was our grocery list. My mistake. They laughed again, but Margaret saw it. Celia's eyes didn't smile anymore. They scanned, calculated. Later that night, as Margaret walked past the office to return a borrowed book, she caught a flicker from Celia's laptop screen. The door was cracked open. The blue glow lit Celia's face in sharp profile. She was chewing a thumbnail. Margaret paused, holding her breath. Celia was on a legal forum, scrolling, clicking. Search bar. How to get guardianship over elderly parent-in-law. Related searches. Can dementia be declared without a diagnosis? Results. Steps to file for temporary guardianship. How to prove cognitive decline. Using medication logs and memory journals in court. Margaret stepped away from the door, her pulse steady but her jaw tight. She returned to her room, locked the door, opened a drawer. Inside, the P.O. box receipt, the camera files, and now the sealed neurologist report. The calendar game had ended. She would still play, but the next move wouldn't be on paper. Margaret sees Celia Googling guardianship over elderly parent. They whispered about dementia. I handed them a forged report and smiled. Margaret plants a fake medical report suggesting mild cognitive decline. Margaret folded the paper with trembling hands, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to do. The forged report looked real, flawlessly formatted, a watermark added digitally, language borrowed from an online medical journal. It even had Dr. Lang's name at the top, minus the signature. The diagnosis, mild cognitive impairment with recommendation for periodic evaluation. She tucked it into a file folder labeled Medical 2023 and slid it neatly into the kitchen drawer where Celia stored her bills and grocery lists, right beneath a receipt for Himalayan sea salt and a yoga mat. Then she waited. That afternoon, Margaret sat quietly on the porch with her crossword puzzle, a faint breeze ruffling the edge of the newspaper. From inside the house, muffled voices filtered through the screen door. A drawer opened, paper shifted. Silence. Then Celia's voice, breathy with excitement. Oh my God! Aaron! Margaret didn't move. She has a diagnosis. Look, it's from her neurologist. It's mild now, but it's starting. Aaron said something Margaret couldn't catch. Hesitant, half-hearted. Celia replied, This changes everything. If we act now, we can legally manage things before it gets worse. A moment of quiet passed. Then Celia's voice dropped to a whisper. You know what this means, right? If she signs anything after this, she could be considered unfit. Margaret turned a page in her crossword. She filled in the word pawn with clean, deliberate strokes. Later that night, Celia paced the kitchen with her phone tucked between shoulder and cheek, voice hushed but urgent. Margaret sat in the living room, knitting with methodical grace, but her ears were trained like antennae. No, I haven't told her yet, Celia whispered. I want to be sure we've got a legal foundation. I'll schedule something next week, a proper evaluation. Yes, a full cognitive panel. If we get that on paper, we can prove it. Then the trust. She paused. I mean, it's better than waiting until she accidentally burns down the house or something. Margaret kept her hands moving, the soft clicking of her knitting needles masking the simmer of something far more powerful than anger. Confirmation. She had given Celia just enough rope, and she was watching her loop it. The next morning, Margaret took a walk to the park and met her friend Janet, silver curls, trench coat, and attitude. They sat on a bench under the jacaranda trees, petals drifting like purple confetti. She took the bait, Margaret said, sipping her tea from a travel mug. Read it like a love letter. Janet raised an eyebrow. You sure this is the way? It has to be. If I confront her now, I'm emotional, paranoid. But if I let her build the case and she walks right into it. Janet smiled slowly. Then you're not crazy. You're strategic. Margaret nodded. I'm about to become invisible, but not powerless. That evening, Margaret returned to find Celia in the dining room with her laptop open. Aaron hovered nearby, watching but not contributing. Celia smiled when she saw her. Too wide, too careful. Hi, Margaret, she said, voice sticky with performative warmth. I was just looking into something for you. Thought it might be helpful to get you a little evaluation. Nothing big, just a check-in, like a wellness thing. Oh? Margaret said, feigning confusion. Am I unwell? Of course not, Celia cooed. It's good to be proactive. Margaret blinked slowly, then nodded. I appreciate you thinking of me. Celia turned back to her screen, satisfied. Behind her, Aaron looked uncomfortable, guilt twisting at the corners of his mouth, but he said nothing. Margaret stepped into the kitchen, opened a fresh notebook, and scribbled down the time and date. She underlined the word evaluation, then circled it. Celia tries to schedule an evaluation behind Margaret's back. They said I failed the memory test, but it was them who forgot my history. The clipboard hit the table with a soft thud, but the weight in the room tripled. Margaret sat perfectly upright on the living room couch, cardigan buttoned to the top, hands folded over her lap like she was waiting for a church hymn to begin. Across from her, the specialist, a woman in her 40s with a disarming smile and calm eyes, clicked her pen and began. We're just going to go through a few simple exercises, Margaret. Nothing to worry about. Celia hovered by the fireplace like a stage manager, lips pressed tight to suppress excitement. Aaron stood back, arms crossed, as if trying to disappear into the wallpaper. Margaret smiled sweetly. Of course, dear. Ask away. The first questions were easy. What's today's date? Margaret tilted her head, furrowed her brow. April 4th? No, 16th? Can you spell world backwards? She blinked. No, that's not right. I'm sorry, I get jumbled. Celia exchanged a knowing glance with the doctor, then offered a condescending nod. She has good days and bad ones. Margaret watched it all like a play she'd read ahead of time. The script was familiar now. Celia needed a shaky performance. Margaret gave her one, just enough stammer, just enough missteps to seem convincing, until the very last question. Can you describe what a trust is? The doctor asked casually. Margaret paused, let her eyes drift, then answered slowly. A trust, she said, is a legal arrangement where one party, called the trustee, holds property on behalf of another, known as the beneficiary, unless, of course, it's an irrevocable trust, then no one's getting their sticky fingers on it without a clause reversal. The doctor looked up from her clipboard. Margaret blinked, then smiled innocently. Oh dear, I used to do a lot of reading before I got fuzzy. The doctor chuckled softly but said nothing. Celia looked rattled. After the session, the doctor took Aaron and Celia aside in the hallway. Margaret, left alone, walked calmly into the kitchen and turned on the kettle like it was any ordinary afternoon. But her ears strained to catch every word drifting from the doorway. Her answers were inconsistent, the doctor said gently. Some confusion, yes, but also moments of high-level recall. That kind of disparity doesn't indicate dementia. It may reflect anxiety or even situational manipulation. Celia's tone sharpened. So, what, she's fine? I'm recommending observation, the doctor clarified. Not commitment. This doesn't meet the threshold for legal guardianship. A long pause. Margaret could practically hear Celia's jaw tighten. Aaron murmured something non-committal. A verbal shrug. The kettle whistled, sharp and sudden. Margaret turned it off before it boiled over. That night, after dishes had been loaded and Celia retreated to the bedroom with a glass of wine, and Aaron scrolled on his phone in the den, Margaret slipped into the guest room and pulled out her phone. There it was, still saved in her voicemail, a message from 4 days ago. Celia's voice, urgent and too casual. Once we get the report, it's just paperwork. Margaret's a gold mine waiting to crack, and no one fights an Alzheimer's diagnosis, not even her. Margaret stared at the screen for a moment, not moving. Then she pressed delete. She already had it saved elsewhere, on her flash drive, on the cloud, even in a folder tucked away in Janet's desk drawer. But now it was gone from the one place Celia might one day request to check. She placed the phone down, walked to the window, looked at the moon above the lawn. Still, calm, untouched by all their noise. They had given her a test, and she had let them think they passed. Margaret deletes a voicemail where Celia calls her a gold mine waiting to crack. Celia thought she was safe whispering lies, but the window was open. The laughter floated through the hedge like perfume, light, casual, and cruel. Margaret was kneeling beside her roses in the front yard, pruning shears in hand when she heard it. It came from the porch next door. Celia's voice, unmistakable in its sharpness, softened only by the attempt to sound innocent. "She asked me this morning where the sugar was," Celia said, followed by a giggle. "We haven't kept sugar in the cabinet in 2 years." And then she just stood there, holding a sponge like she'd forgotten what it was. Another woman chuckled, then lowered her voice. "You think it's getting worse?" "Oh, definitely," Celia replied. "She doesn't even know what month it is half the time. Aaron and I are being saints just keeping her here." Margaret didn't move, just quietly snipped the last brown leaf from a rose stem. What Celia didn't realize was that the guest she was gossiping with, Deborah Lane, widow of the local pharmacist, had walked to the porch with the intention of delivering a mason jar of homemade fig jam. And what Celia also didn't realize was that the window behind her was cracked open. 2 days later, Deborah showed up at Margaret's back door with the jam and a folded piece of paper clutched tightly in her hand. "I wasn't eavesdropping," she said. "But the window was open and my hearing isn't as bad as people think." Margaret motioned her inside, offered her a seat and a cup of mint tea. "She's gunning for your estate," Deborah said bluntly. "She made it sound like you're circling the drain and that she's just waiting for the paperwork to catch up." Margaret stirred her tea without flinching. "I know." Deborah blinked. "You do?" "I've known for weeks. I just didn't know who else knew." Deborah hesitated, then slid the folded note across the table. "If you ever need a statement, or someone to testify, I'm here. No one gets to erase people like this." Margaret gave a small, grateful nod, then stood. She walked to the cabinet, unlocked the second drawer, and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. "This is my neurologist's full cognitive report," she said, handing it to Deborah. "Real one, unopened. I have 2 other copies stored off-site, but I want you to hold this." "For what?" Margaret gave her a small smile. "Insurance." That evening, Margaret sat on the porch with a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, her favorite book open in her lap, and a confused look painted on her face. She watched the sun dip low, letting her gaze wander slowly as Celia approached from the driveway. "Hey, Margaret," Celia said, faux cheerful. "You okay out here?" Margaret blinked. I was just trying to find the kitchen. I thought this was the hallway." Celia gave her a saccharine smile and guided her by the elbow. "You must have gotten turned around again." Margaret nodded gently. "Thank you, dear." But behind the performance, her mind stayed sharp, focused. Later that night, the same friend from the porch, Heather, came by again. This time, Margaret was in her room, door ajar, pretending to nap. Celia didn't know anyone was listening. "I give it 3 months tops," Celia whispered to Heather. "Maybe less. Once we have her evaluated again and get guardianship started, the rest is just procedural." Margaret stayed still, eyes closed, heart steady. But her hand slid under her pillow and tapped her phone, recording. She didn't need to catch them slipping. They were already in free fall. Margaret watches Celia whisper to her friend, "I give it 3 months tops. She said I'd forget the deed transfer. I never did." The ink had barely dried when Margaret folded the documents back into the envelope and sealed them tight with a calm, practiced hand. It was done, sold, quietly, cleanly. No notices were mailed to the house. No emails pinged Aaron's inbox. No alerts lit up Celia's phone. Because Margaret had planned this piece of the board years before any of them had started whispering. The small 2-bedroom property in Sandridge, an old investment home from the early days of her marriage, had sat dormant for years. It wasn't glamorous, but it was fully owned. And more importantly, it had never been included in the primary family trust. It lived in a quiet little side fund Margaret had titled Tamarind Legacy Trust, buried under her maiden name and registered in a state Celia couldn't find on her best day with Wi-Fi. She remembered the conversation vividly. 4 years ago, Celia had glanced over a stack of documents at the kitchen table and asked flippantly, "You really think you need to keep track of all these deed transfers at your age? You'll forget half of them by next week." Margaret had smiled then. "I remember what matters." Celia laughed. "We'll sort it out eventually. I mean, once it's all, passed through probate or whatever." But probate never touched the Sandridge house, because Margaret had never intended it to. The property sold in under 2 weeks. The market was hot, and the buyers were cash-ready. She worked through a discreet third-party firm, one that didn't trigger the usual estate-related financial alerts. The check arrived via overnight courier, $243,000, no questions asked. She didn't deposit it locally. Instead, she took a quiet day trip to another state, just one border over, and opened a checking account under her trust's LLC. She deposited half the funds. The other half? She moved to a certificate of deposit under a 6-month lock-in. The bank manager, a kind-eyed woman who didn't press her with helpful questions, offered her a lollipop on the way out. Margaret took 2. Back home, the air had shifted. Celia had grown more brazen in her hovering, asking Margaret to review some numbers together while feigning helpfulness. Aaron had started watching her more closely, like he was assessing her for a job she hadn't applied for. They didn't say it out loud, but Margaret could feel it in the way they stood behind her at the counter, the way they watched her hands when she handled her wallet. They were waiting for her to slip, for the account to freeze, for the money they believed they were owed. One night, Margaret heard Celia moving around in the office, the sound of keys tapping, a sharp inhale, silence. Then, "Why is it saying access denied?" A beat. Aaron's voice followed. "Try again. Maybe it's the Wi-Fi." More keys. Then Celia's tone, cold and urgent. "No, it's locked. It's completely locked. What the hell? Why would she change the login?" Margaret sat upstairs, in her room, in the dark, listening to the frantic clicking below like it was the overture to a long-awaited opera. She reached into her bedside drawer and removed the little leather notebook that held every move she'd made for the past 6 months. She opened to a page marked with a paperclip and wrote a new line. Asset sold. Trust funded. Account moved. Portal locked. She closed the book. Slept with a smile. Celia stayed up half the night, refreshing the screen, trying forgotten passwords and recovery options, but the screen wouldn't budge. "This account is no longer accessible through this portal." She stared at it, as if disbelief might change code. It didn't. Celia logs into Margaret's bank portal, only to find an error message. "They planned a birthday for me. I planned the guest list." The banner read, "Happy 75th, Margaret," in looping gold letters. But everything about it felt staged, sterile, like a set for a play she didn't audition for. The living room had been rearranged for the occasion, streamers draped awkwardly from the ceiling fan. A table in the corner offered store-bought cupcakes and lukewarm, sparkling cider. And right in the center of it all, Margaret stood in her own home, greeted with applause like a special guest at a show meant to convince people she didn't belong. "Surprise!" Celia sang, far too loud. Her smile was all teeth. "We thought you'd forget, so we made sure not to." Margaret gave a slow, uncertain clap, mimicking confusion just enough. "Oh goodness! What day is it?" Laughter bubbled from the guests. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. Just the kind of laugh people give when they're not sure if they're in on the joke or witnessing something sad. Aaron wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders. "We figured this might lift your spirits." Margaret blinked, glancing around the room. Familiar faces from the neighborhood, a couple of Celia's friends from yoga, and one man from Aaron's office she'd never seen before. What they didn't realize, what Celia definitely didn't realize, was that Margaret had also invited a few guests. They just hadn't arrived yet. At 2:16 p.m., the doorbell rang. Celia, flustered and mid-sentence about Margaret's adorable forgetfulness, paused and went to answer it. Margaret turned to Aaron. "Do I know who's coming?" Aaron chuckled awkwardly. "Probably not, but that's part of the surprise, right?" Celia returned moments later, color drained slightly from her face. Behind her walked a tall woman with wire-frame glasses, a gray folder tucked under her arm. Marla Rothman, attorney at law. Right behind her, Dr. Rashida Lang, board-certified neurologist. And then, unexpectedly, Deborah Lane and Janet Cole, Margaret's two closest confidants. Celia froze. "What is this?" Margaret smiled. "My guests." For the next hour, Margaret played the part. She hesitated when speaking, stared a little too long at familiar faces, fumbled with her fork once during cake, and all the while, Celia whispered just loud enough, "She's slipping more lately. Poor thing, I've been tracking it." By 3:30, Celia cued the slideshow on the TV with a flourish. A little walk down memory lane. Except when the screen flickered on, it wasn't the photo montage she had arranged. The first slide, a black and white photo of Margaret in her 20s, smiling, strong, standing in front of her first home with her late husband. The caption read, "The house I helped build. The family I never thought would betray me." Celia's eyes widened. "What is this?" The photos rolled forward automatically. Slide 2, Margaret holding Aaron as a baby. "Sacrificed my career for this boy. He stopped calling me Mom the day he married Celia." Slide 3. A candid photo of Margaret at the dinner table, alone, birthday candles in front of her, everyone else standing in the kitchen. "They served cake to each other before they served me," the guests murmured. Slide 4. A photo of Margaret's medication drawer, disorganized and tampered. "I wasn't confused. I was being managed." Gasps now. Celia stormed toward the TV. "Turn it off." Margaret, calm as ever, raised the small remote and froze the final slide, a solid black background with white text. "Let's talk about the will." Silence fell like a stone. Celia turned toward Margaret, flushed and furious. "You did this on your birthday?" "No," Margaret said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You did. I just brought the right people to watch." Aaron looked at Marla. "Is this some kind of ambush?" Marla folded her arms. "It's called a reality check." Dr. Lang nodded. "And she's as lucid as any one of us." No one touched the cake after that. Margaret looked around the room, people shifting uncomfortably, guilt flickering in a few eyes, defensiveness flaring in others. She took a deep breath, walked to the center of the room, and picked up her glass of cider. "I may be 75, she said, raising it slowly. "But my memory is sharp. My patience is not. So, shall we continue?" Last slide. "Let's talk about the will." The room goes silent. They expected to inherit. Instead, they got educated. Margaret reads aloud a decoy will, then announces it was never filed. The silence from the slideshow still clung to the walls like static. Celia stood frozen, mouth parted just enough to betray her shock, one hand still raised mid-gesture. Around the room, guests exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others captivated. No one moved toward the cake, not even Aaron. Margaret, unfazed, picked up a folder from the nearby sideboard with the calm of a woman placing the final piece in a very long, very strategic game. "I'd like to read something," she said softly, but the words rang through the living room with unnerving clarity. Aaron finally spoke. "Mom, maybe this isn't the time." Margaret looked at him once, just once, and he quieted. She opened the folder and pulled out a printed will with an embossed cover, and Celia's name highlighted in yellow. "This is what you expected," she said, holding it up. "The version of my estate that leaves everything in your hands, Celia. The version that grants you medical power of attorney, asset management, and executorship." Celia's face shifted from red to pale in seconds. That's my copy. That's the one you signed with Marla 10 years ago." Margaret gave a small smile. "It's also the one I revoked 5 years ago, privately, legally." She let that land before continuing. "This copy? It's a decoy, a placeholder, a narrative prop for those who assumed the ending was already written." The tension cracked like ice underfoot. "I'm sorry," Aaron said, his voice thin. "You revoked it?" Margaret nodded, setting the decoy will aside and pulling a second envelope from her handbag. This one she handed to Marla, who stood from her seat and faced the guests like a conductor about to cue an orchestra. "I, Marla Rothman, attorney of record for Margaret Ellis, can confirm that her active, legal, and fully notarized will was updated in 2021, Marla said. "The new executor is Janet Cole." From the back of the room, Janet blinked in surprise. "Wait, me?" Margaret smiled. "Yes. You're the only one who didn't ask what I was leaving. You just asked if I needed help getting there." Celia's voice exploded, sharp as a cracked mirror. "This is insanity! You're seriously handing your estate to a woman who sells scarves at a craft fair?" Janet shrugged. "They're embroidered, but sure." Guests stifled laughter, but Celia wasn't finished. "This is a stunt. You're playing mind games, Margaret. I'm your daughter-in-law. Aaron is your son. You owe us—" "Owe?" Margaret's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. "I owed you civility. I gave it. I owed you shelter. I gave it. I owed you love and you mistook it for leverage. Now, I owe you nothing but distance." Celia's hands balled into fists at her sides, her chest heaving. "You can't just change the will like that. That's not how this works." Aaron, finally flustered enough to show it, put a hand on her arm. "Celia, stop!" "No," she snapped. "She's gaslighting all of us with these stunts and this little slideshow of passive-aggressive trauma." Margaret calmly closed the folder and turned toward the door. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't cut the cake. She just walked out. That night, in the quiet of her study, Margaret lit the fireplace and watched the decoy will burn, page by page, line by line. The flames curled the corners of the document, devouring each lie it had been built to expose. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and inside, the house felt like it belonged to her again, for the first time in years. Meanwhile, across town, Celia paced the living room, her jaw clenched so tight her voice came out through her teeth. "She humiliated me." She pressed the speakerphone button and dialed. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Yeah?" "It's me," Celia said. "I need help. Legal help. She changed the will, and if she thinks this is over, she's wrong." A pause. "Let me guess," the voice said. "You want to fight it." Celia's lips curled. "I want to bury it." Celia calls her brother, a corporate lawyer. "They built a file on my decline. I built a file on their greed." The courthouse smelled of floor polish and old paper, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like anxious thoughts. Margaret sat in the front row, hands folded neatly in her lap, pearls glinting against her navy blue blouse. She wore her late husband's watch, not for time, but for memory. The second hand ticked steadily as her daughter-in-law, Celia, took the stand. "She's confused. She wanders," Celia told the judge, adopting a sorrowful tone. "She forgets conversations. She leaves burners on. We're just trying to protect her." Margaret tilted her head slightly. No one mentioned that the burner had never been lit, that Celia's notes about Margaret's decline had been scribbled in hindsight to match a story, that her memory calendar had mysteriously disappeared after the birthday party fallout. But Margaret had receipts, literally. Her lawyer, Marla, approached the bench with a well-worn folder. She moved with the confidence of someone who wasn't improvising, just unveiling. "If I may, Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to submit evidence that paints a fuller picture." She handed over 3 labeled binders. The judge flipped through the first, Exhibit A, audio recordings. Snippets of Celia's voice played in court, recorded from Margaret's phone and discreetly backed up. "Once we get guardianship, everything else is paperwork. She won't fight. She doesn't even know what month it is." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Exhibit B, neurologist's report. Signed, dated, and stamped by Dr. Rashida Lang. Clearance confirming Margaret's cognitive health in 3 separate evaluations. Exhibit C, timeline logs. Each moment Celia had cited as a memory lapse, cross-referenced against phone records, video footage, or written notes, dates, times, context, even the infamous lost spoon was catalogued, with photo evidence. Celia's face tightened as the judge flipped through the proof. Her lawyer tried to object, but the judge held up a hand. "Let her speak," he said. "She's earned it." Margaret stood slowly, walked to the center of the courtroom. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look angry, just resolved. "I was never confused," she said. "I was studied, scrutinized, misquoted, and misrepresented. I was told I misplaced silverware I never touched. I was told my kindness meant I was slipping. I've watched as people I helped raise built a case not to care for me, but to control me." She turned toward Celia. "You built a file on my decline. I built one on your greed." Gasps. Silence. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Celia's lawyer whispered something rapidly to her, but Celia was frozen. Then Aaron was called. He sat down, cleared his throat. "Do you believe your mother is mentally unfit to manage her affairs?" the judge asked. Aaron looked down, then over at Margaret, who didn't glare, didn't plead, just waited. "No," he said finally. "She's not." Celia snapped her head toward him. "Aaron, what are you doing?" He didn't respond. He just stood and left the witness box with his head down. The judge closed the file. "Ms. Ellis, you are declared fully capable of managing your own affairs. The guardianship request is denied. Furthermore, given the nature of the evidence provided, I am awarding legal damages for emotional distress and attempted estate interference." Celia's mouth fell open. Margaret nodded once, a small, satisfied breath leaving her lips. She had not just won. She had dismantled their story. Outside the courthouse, the wind was cool and crisp. Margaret stood on the steps, flanked by Marla and Janet, the sun catching the gold edge of her watch. Marla checked her phone. "Looks like some reporters are sniffing around already." Margaret smiled faintly. "Let them." She turned her face toward the breeze. Free, finally. Margaret is awarded full independence and legal damages. She wanted to silence me legally. I answered with a legacy. The paper was thick, cotton parchment, the kind that held weight even before a single word was written. Margaret chose it intentionally. Words on paper could be torn, dismissed. But weight left a mark. She uncapped the fountain pen and paused. The house was still. The ticking of the clock in the hallway stretched each second. A warm breeze drifted in through the cracked window, rustling the edge of the letterhead like it was urging her forward. At the top of the page, she wrote, "To my son, Aaron." And then she began, "You were born in winter. You screamed like someone had stolen your breath. I remember holding you against my chest, whispering, 'No one's going to take anything from you, not ever.' For 30 years, I stood between you and the worst of the world. When your father got sick, I held everything together with 2 hands and a fraying rope. You never saw me break, because I never let you. When you married Celia, I told myself she would become your new home, that my job was done, but you let her turn me into a guest in the house I helped you buy. You watched her smile while she told lies about my memory. You stood beside her while she tracked my confusion on calendars I never asked for. You sat across from me and called it concern, while quietly preparing to take control of everything I'd built. The ink bled slowly into the parchment, curling into elegant shapes as she moved through her pain, not in rage, but in reflection. She didn't write to blame. She wrote to remind of what had been sacrificed, of what had been silent. "I loved you enough to raise you," she wrote, "but not enough to be erased by you." She signed it not as Mom, but as Margaret Ellis, with the same signature she'd placed on trust documents, property deeds, and legal counterfilings. Then she folded the letter into thirds and placed it in the envelope beside her newly signed will, the real one, the final one, the one that reflected not only her assets but her awakening. Later that day, the doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door to a mail courier in a Navy uniform. "I've got a certified delivery here," he said, checking the name. "For Celia Green." Margaret smiled faintly. "Perfect." She handed over the manila envelope, sealed and stamped with official markings. Inside, notice of estate removal. A line in bold near the top, Effective immediately, Celia Green is removed from all trusts, inheritance paths, and estate benefits tied to the name Margaret Ellis, per updated legal documentation, filed and notarized on date. She watched from the porch as the courier walked down the driveway and into his van, the envelope tucked under his arm like a quiet verdict. Across town, Celia was unloading groceries into their kitchen when the doorbell rang. She opened it casually, hair tied back, earbuds still in. "Delivery for Celia Green," the man said, handing her the envelope with a clipboard. She signed without thinking, closed the door, opened it, and froze. Her eyes scanned the title once, twice, then again. Her face drained of color as she read the words out loud, breath catching. "Notice of estate removal?" She dropped the envelope onto the counter, lips moving silently as she flipped through the contents. Legal seals, language too sharp to argue with, and Margaret's signature like a scar across the bottom of every page. Aaron entered the kitchen mid-scroll. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer, just whispered, "She cut us out." At that same moment, Margaret stood at her garden window watching sunlight pour across the herbs and lilies, not in triumph, not even in satisfaction, but in peace. She reached for a different envelope, Deborah's letter. She hadn't opened it yet. Not all notes were meant to be read right away. Some you saved, others you sent. Celia receives a certified letter, notice of estate removal. One signature, that's all it took to bury their future. Margaret transfers 90% of her estate to a dementia foundation under her maiden name. The pen felt heavier than it should have, not in weight, but in meaning. Margaret sat at the long oak table in the office of Dunley and Weiss Trust Management, the morning sun casting streaks of amber across polished wood. Her lawyer, Marla, sat beside her, calm, unreadable. Across from them, a notary read aloud the terms of the final document. Margaret listened silently, her breath steady. "And this irrevocable charitable trust shall be established in the name of M.E. Whitlock, benefiting the National Dementia Awareness and Justice Fund." Margaret nodded. Whitlock, her maiden name. Before marriage, before motherhood, before sacrifice. A name unsoiled by manipulation or greed. "You're ready?" the notary asked. She picked up the pen, rolled it once between her fingers, and signed. Just a signature. But it changed everything. The trust transferred 90% of Margaret's remaining estate, properties, investments, cash reserves, into a philanthropic arm designed to support victims of elder financial abuse, dementia misdiagnosis, and family exploitation. It was airtight, non-reversible, publicly filed. Of the remaining 10%, she left half to Janet and the other half to her late husband's caregiver, Thomas, a quiet man who once sat beside her at 3 a.m. while she cried into lukewarm tea. Not a penny went to Aaron, not a cent to Celia. The news broke 2 days later. An independent journalist covering local elder law reform had caught wind of the filing and ran the headline, "Widow Rewrites Her Legacy, Silences Abusers with a Signature." The story exploded online. And Celia exploded in person. It happened on the courthouse steps. Margaret had arrived early for a panel discussion on elder protections. She wore a soft cream blouse and pearl earrings, the wind tousling her silvery hair. She looked like every other retired schoolteacher on a quiet Tuesday morning, except this one had detonated her family's entitlement with a ballpoint pen. Celia was already there, red-faced, waiting, pacing. As Margaret approached the doors, she stormed toward her. "You witch!" Celia spat, voice already too loud for the crowd. "You think this makes you a hero? You're just bitter, you're vengeful, you ruined your son's life!" Margaret didn't flinch, didn't blink. "I saved mine," Celia jabbed a finger in her direction. "This trust stunt, this publicity play, you're going to regret it. We could have taken care of you." Margaret's voice cut through her like cold steel. "You lied about dementia, Celia. You built a fantasy where I was fading, where I was easy to steal from. You mocked me at brunch. You tampered with medication. You made me pretend to be confused just to gather evidence." The courthouse crowd, a mix of lawyers, reporters, and public attendees, had turned to watch. Margaret took a step closer, her voice calm. Now you want the spotlight? Fine. Let's raise awareness. Together. She turned toward the cameras. Celia stood stunned, mouth parted, rage suspended by disbelief. That's when the news van pulled up. 2 women stepped out, local TV anchors with mics and notepads. One of them smiled kindly. Ms. Ellis? We're with Channel 8. Could we ask you a few questions about your donation and recent case? Margaret looked back at Celia, then at the reporters. She adjusted her collar, smoothed the hem of her blouse. Of course, she said. She stepped forward, toward the mic, toward the truth, toward a narrative she finally owned. Behind her, Celia stood on the courthouse steps, shrinking under the weight of her own fury. Aaron wasn't there, not today, not anymore. And somewhere in the state archives, a signature lay beneath glass. M.E. Whitlock, a name they'd forgotten, a woman they'd underestimated. A TV news crew approaches Margaret outside the courthouse. She thought I'd fade into silence. Instead, I went viral. The camera rolled, the red light blinked, and Margaret Ellis leaned in, not with fear, but with focus. The interview room was quiet, save for the low hum of studio lights and the occasional shuffle of a cameraman repositioning his lens. Margaret sat in a simple armchair with a lapel mic clipped just beneath her collarbone. Her hair, brushed into a smooth wave, glinted silver under the lighting rig. Her eyes were sharp, steady. Let's start at the beginning, the producer prompted gently. What made you first realize something was wrong? Margaret folded her hands. They started treating me like I was already gone. The interview was meant to be a small piece, part of a nonprofit's digital campaign on elder fraud. A 15-minute video uploaded to YouTube and shared with senior centers and retirement planning groups. But by the next morning, it had surpassed 1.2 million views. Clips of Margaret's voice, controlled, layered, calm, flooded social media. They whispered about dementia behind my back, then smiled to my face. I wasn't confused. I was collecting evidence. My age wasn't my weakness. It was their blind spot. Hashtags trended. Don't erase her. Margaret didn't forget. Gray doesn't mean gone. She had become more than a woman with a past. She became a symbol with a voice. Within a week, the nonprofit received so many donations, they launched a new legal aid division for at-risk seniors. Margaret donated her entire interview fee to help fund it, under one condition. I want every woman who watches this and feels powerless to know someone believed her first. Her words made it onto posters, onto T-shirts, onto courtroom pamphlets across 6 states. Meanwhile, in a corner office of a corporate marketing firm, Celia sat frozen at her desk. Her boss entered quietly and closed the door. "We can't keep you," he said simply. "The video, it's everywhere. This company doesn't support what you did, on camera or behind it." "I didn't do anything illegal," Celia snapped. "But you did something unforgettable," he replied, "and unforgivable." Celia was out before the week ended. Aaron called 3 days later. Margaret didn't answer. He called again, then finally left a voicemail that crackled with remorse. "Mom, I know I didn't protect you the way I should have. I thought staying silent was keeping the peace. But I see it now. I see her. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She listened once, deleted it. Some things deserved forgiveness. Some things just needed release. Aaron moved out of the house not long after. He didn't take much. He didn't try to stay. Margaret spent the next few days quietly, watering her garden, writing thank you letters, responding to senior advocates who emailed from all over the country. Some wrote paragraphs, others just wrote 2 words, "Thank you." And then, on a crisp morning near the end of October, a white envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a letter, embossed with the logo of a major publishing house. "Dear Ms. Ellis, we've followed your story with deep admiration. We believe your voice, wisdom, and journey could impact readers in a profound way. We'd like to offer you a book deal. To tell your story in full." Margaret read it twice. Then set it gently on the kitchen counter and poured herself a cup of tea. She sat by the window, watching a bird land softly on the porch rail. Its wings rustled in the wind. Its eyes scanned the sky like it already knew where it was going next. Margaret smiled. She did too. Margaret is offered a book deal. She tried to erase me, but I became unforgettable. The shovel cut clean through the soil, soft and dark from the autumn rain. Margaret pressed her foot to the edge of the blade, pushed down, and lifted a scoop with steady hands. The roots of a young magnolia tree waited patiently beside her, bundled in burlap, its leaves trembling in the wind like it, too, remembered something. With every tree she planted, she buried something behind it. A lesson, a memory, a chapter of her book. The first tree, a maple, had gone in 2 weeks earlier, after she finished the chapter called "The Spoon She Hid." It stood now by the corner of the garden, its red leaves fanned like a quiet flame. Today's chapter? The goodbye letter. She smiled as she lowered the magnolia into the earth. Each tree had a page sealed in plastic, tied beneath its roots, her own tradition, a ritual of reclamation. When the last page of the manuscript was complete, so would the garden be, and it would grow long after she was gone. The letters poured in like waves. Some came handwritten, trembling script from women in their 80s. Others were typed, printed, even emailed and forwarded through the publisher's office. Veterans, teachers, widows, grandfathers, estranged daughters. "I showed your video to my father. He cried, said no one had believed him until now. Thank you for giving people like me a voice. They said I was forgetful. I was just tired of being talked over." Margaret kept them in boxes, read one every morning with her tea. She never rushed through them. Each one deserved to be heard, even if silently. One chilly afternoon, Janet pulled into the driveway with a cardboard sign sticking out the passenger window. "Ellis House, now a sanctuary." They laughed together as they hammered it into the front yard. The Ellis home, once host to shadows and staged smiles, was now deeded to a nonprofit for women over 60 escaping financial abuse, predatory adult children, or guardianship coercion. Margaret didn't need the space anymore. She had already moved into a quiet cottage by the lake, a place with wide windows, clean light, and shelves lined with journals. This was never about revenge, Margaret told Janet over soup. It was about reclamation. Janet grinned. Still, pretty satisfying, though. They both laughed. The final shot came on a sun-drenched morning. A crowd had gathered in the park where the city hosted its annual Community Justice Symposium. Rows of folding chairs filled with teachers, lawmakers, volunteers, and families. At the front, a low stage with a single podium and microphone. Margaret stepped up in a pressed navy coat, her signature gold pendant catching the sunlight like a signal flare. The crowd hushed. "I was told I was losing myself," she began, when in fact I was finally returning to me. She spoke not as a victim, but as a survivor, a builder. A voice that had once been underestimated, now amplified by truth. "I was never losing my memory," she said, her voice steady, her eyes bright. A pause. Then she smiled, gently, powerfully. "I was just remembering who to forget. I was never losing my memory. I was just remembering who to forget."